To have Professor Venkatesh Narayanamurti with us here today, visiting Delhi and India and agreeing to take out some of his time and make this presentation at the IIC and in collaboration with the IIC. I am just going to try and read out his biography as succinctly as I can, and then turn it over to Ambassador Saran, who will introduce him a little bit more, and then Venki will give us his presentation, which, as I understand, he wants it to be rather interactive and really engage with the audience. So we hope that you will follow that tradition. So Venki, or Professor Venkatesh Narayanamurti, is the Professor of Technology and Public Policy in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and the Kennedy School of Government at the University of Harvard. He used to be Director of the Science, Technology and Public Policy Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He was also founding Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard and Dean of the Physical Sciences at Harvard. Before that, he was Vice President of Research at Sandia National Labs and also Director of Solid State Electronics Research at Bell Labs. I've decided I'm not going to read out all the different things that he's done, but just sort of say that he's served on numerous advisory boards of the federal government, research universities, national laboratories, and industry. And from 2011 to 2015, he served as Foreign Secretary of the US National Academy of Engineering. He's the author of more than 240 scientific papers in different areas of condensed matter and applied physics, and the author of 2 books, which I think some of those, the ideas in those books he's going to draw from in this talk. So I will leave it there, and maybe Ambassador Saran can come next.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Radhika. Let me extend a very warm welcome to Professor Narayanamurti from Harvard, and also to his wife, Mrs. Narayanamurti, who is also with us this evening. I, of course, had the privilege of meeting Professor Narayanamurti in Harvard when I was there on a short fellowship. And of course, as you have heard, he has extremely, incredible, I would say, credentials. And let me just give you a little background as to how we decided to have this talk. We at the India International Center, with the support of the Niti Aayog, as also the collaboration of Center for Policy Research, we have been thinking of, in fact, putting in place a series of talks, what we are calling TED Talks or Metamorphosis, which would spread over a whole year. And the basic motivation for this was a realization that, there is technology which we are using all the time, our smartphones or internet. There is a new language which we hear all the time, a language of algorithms, of bots, of social media, trolling, a lot of which we hear, but we do not know what this new language is all about. So I would say that perhaps we are living in an era where the gap between technological advancement and our understanding of technology, perhaps this gap has never been as much as it is today. Technology, which brings a lot of convenience to our lives, it has really transformed our lives, but it also has very major impact on human relations, just human communications, major impact on society, social attitudes. You have been reading about the whole controversy about Cambridge Analytica and the use of social media, of Facebook, for influencing political developments in country. So there is a lot happening, a lot of implications which perhaps we are not very fully aware of and fully understand what this technology is all about. So there is a lot of benefit from technology, which we should of course embrace, but there is also risks in the technology we should try to understand and try to mitigate. I had originally thought I could get Professor Narayanamurti to actually launch that particular series, but it was not always possible to do that with very busy and eminent people like him. But it just so happened that when we were talking to him, he said he is coming to India, and we thought even if it is not as part of that series, it would be really wonderful to have somebody as knowledgeable as him to really talk about technology, about society, the kind of awareness that our political leadership needs, citizens need about the new technology and the revolution that is taking place in technology. So we are very, very grateful to Professor Narayanamurti for finding time to come to India International Center and to share some of his thoughts with us. So those words, may I invite Professor Narayanamurti to make his presentation. And thank you very much for coming this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Saran, and also Radhika for you outdid yourselves here. I'm really delighted to be here today because this is a subject where I literally have devoted some last 10 or 15 years of my life, and that is one of the reasons I actually went to Harvard about 20 years ago. And because technology and society are so intimately linked that I think for educating, people, we used to have classes at Harvard and other places, physics for poets. Now this is a place where art and culture are important, but this is more than that. After being at the Kennedy School for the last 10 years and finding that how much influence that institution had in the political leadership of the United States, and the influence I had there as a faculty member or as director of the science was far greater than being double dean at Harvard. So that tells you how the political landscape, how critical that is in fact, governance. And so I think it's quite important that we educate our future leaders, and Harvard prides itself not only in the future presidents of the United States, but also a lot of future presidents of various corporations, etc., with literally who's who, that in fact, I have been thinking deeply about this question of technology in a liberal arts environment. Yeah. You can't hear me? So about technology as a part of liberal education and in a liberal arts environment. Actually, when the School of Engineering was created at Harvard in 2007, Harvard has an interesting history where engineering has come and gone over decades. It's done at MIT, but it's not done in institutions like Harvard. I never understood that logic because, in fact, it is the only missing element, even though we had a business school and law school and all the other professional ones, and the only one which was somewhat delegated to MIT was engineering. But really, in fact, when it was founded in 2008, formally 2007, I had Chuck West, president of the former president of MIT, and president of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, give the keynote address. And Chuck was very sensitive in the Harvard-MIT relationship. We worked very closely. He said, Venki, I'm going to say something in the beginning. I hope people won't mind. And he said, he started his talk by giving a quotation from Winston Churchill that Harvard would take a long time to do certain things, but it eventually will do the right thing. And that really meant that recognition that technology was important in a liberal arts environment. So it tells something about both technology and how liberal arts should change. So that really was music to my ears. I felt joyous because I went to Harvard from Santa Barbara, and Bell Labs was very much like MIT, mainly because I saw the undergraduates were second to none, and I felt that technology has to adapt to that liberal arts environment. I'll give credit to where we are here today, to Delhi, because I studied at St. Stephen's College a long time ago, and there I was a so-called physics nerd, but in fact they insisted I take part in Shakespeare plays, that I was part of the debating society, and also part of the track team. So you automatically were not just a physics nerd, but you were part of a larger. So I actually very much value that education, which come back now, even though I'm very passionate about technology. So I have actually felt, and my arguments which I used with President Lawrence Summers to create, and Ambud Sagar, who's now professor at IIT Delhi, was at that time working with me, in fact, writing some of the proposals, so he knows how tedious it is to get a school established. So you can ask independent evidence from him. That what does it mean to be a leading and societally relevant university in an increasingly globalized world? What does it mean to be a broadly educated person in the 21st century? And what does it mean to be a broadly educated scientist or engineer? I actually feel it's a two-way. Too often, the scientists and engineers were highly specialized, so fascinated by the technology, but I've learned now after 10 years of working with social sciences that actually they're social technical systems, and unless they meet some of those needs, in fact, technology would not reach its full potential. So you need to educate our engineers differently. At the same time, you need to educate the social scientists and the sociologists and the arts and humanities people in a different way to produce the right future leadership. So I often start my classes. I've been teaching this as general education, mixing students from arts and humanities, social sciences, and science and engineering, and literally forcing a dialogue across those. I have many stories to tell, including at the Kennedy School. We will talk later on about the internet, where I had a political scientist, a law, and a computer scientist, and God forbid, to learn them to talk and speak a common language was difficult. I learned through that some of the political science was equally narrow-minded as the engineers were. And because they had their own language, I couldn't understand some of the papers which were written because they had to write it in that way if they were to get tenure in a social science department. I don't know, many of you might be that, but at least one experience at Harvard. So I start my students with two views. About 20 years ago, at the turn of the century, Neil Armstrong, one of my heroes, because he went to the moon just shortly after I went to the United States. I just graduated from Cornell, and Armstrong was going, so he's one of the iconic figures in the world of engineering and technology. He chaired a committee of the National Academy on the achievements of engineering in the 20th century, from electricity to aerospace to telephone, internet, you name it. And students have now taken his speech and made a little. Let's see if it plays. And
I am, and ever will be, a White Sox pocket protector nerdy engineer. Born under the second law of thermodynamics, seeped in the steam tables, in love with free body diagrams, transformed by Laplace and propelled by compressible flow. As an engineer, I take substantial amount of pride in the accomplishments of my profession. Science is about what is, engineering is about what can be. Engineers' entire existence is dedicated to doing things better and more efficiently. It is a profession which leaves its imprint on our society in countless ways. A century ago, the world really needed improvements in quality of life, health, mobility, and living standards. At that time, life was a constant struggle. The 20th was a century often punctuated with the terror of war, darkened with societal struggles to overcome injustice. But the 20th was also the first century in which technology enabled the tenets and the images of those traumas to reach across the world and touch people in ways that were previously unimagined. Engineering helped create a world in which no injustice could be hidden. Many will look back to see how we have changed and what we have accomplished. The future's a bit foggy, but it's not unreasonable to suggest that the 21st century will enjoy a rate of progress not unlike the 20th. It's something to hope for.
This is the words of a great engineer who landed on the moon. And today's young people, actually you watch everybody, not young people, even old people like me, walking with this in their hand, and the engineered machine has become in the palm of your hand, will talk to you, will speak with you, will give you all kinds of information, etc. And so, what about training the future? So the iconic figure of the last couple of decades has been Steve Jobs. He actually was not really an engineer, but he knew how to put certain things together. And a few years ago, he gave the commencement address at Stanford University. Now, Stanford is one of the iconic places, which is both a liberal arts institution, but tremendous accomplishments in engineering and computer science. So let's see what Steve Jobs has to say. He actually had this intersection of technology and the liberal arts.
So, I've said this before, I thought it was worth repeating. It's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. That it's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing.
It is in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with humanities, that yields us with the result that makes our hearts sing. Actually, when I think about this, and I said about the separate issue, which I won't discuss, which I often talk about, is actually there's been a mistaken view of engineering as just being something applied. That is not so at all. Engineers are the great inventors. They create new things from their mind, just like the artists create new structures. So in fact, engineering has a lot more common. It comes out of the mind, while science takes things to where you actually try to understand it. So in fact, the creative part, that's why I call it a invention discovery cycle, that you really have to put engineering in its proper place in education as a linking discipline which involves not only understanding, but also creation. So this is really important because, in fact, the future, the reason we finally created the School of Engineering at Harvard, that in fact I told Larry Summers he would always get a grade of incomplete unless we recognize this fact, because biology, life sciences, medicine are much more similar to engineering than to physics, which is my field. Then, in fact, in 2005, another book came. This is the time when I was debating to create a School of Engineering at Harvard. Thomas Friedman, the well-known New York Times writer, wrote a book, The World is Flat. And if you remember his book, he actually starts his book by sitting in Nandan Nilekani's office in Bangalore and saying how Infosys, Narayanamurti, my namesake, somebody did a Google search, it always brings Infosys chairman and not me, and that's okay if I'm in his shadow. And he says, I'm not saying, after seeing what had happened in India in software technology, Thomas Friedman wrote, I'm not saying that every politician needs to be an engineer, but be helpful if they had a basic understanding of the forces that are flattening the world. Because in fact, AT&T and lots of other companies had wrapped the whole world in a ball of twine, and the twine was actually the fiber optic communication, which makes the cost of communication almost zero. And so that you could do things more effectively anywhere, any place, any time in the world. It's a major transformation. I feel very proud of it since I was quite involved with that kind of work at Bell Laboratories, where there were such futurist thinkers. So the relationship between technology and society is, of course, extremely important. And you have to ask the question. Technology and progress are interrelated, but we have to ask progress towards what, for whom? Sort of the question which even Ambassador Saran was starting to talk about in his introduction. Technology infrastructure reflects social infrastructure. In fact, if it must reflect the social infrastructure, otherwise it won't succeed broadly. And that's the example where, in fact, the smartphone really was something which all of us wanted because of all the things it could do, things which we all care and love. Similarly, in advancing science and technology, we make decisions about which areas to advance and what not to advance. That's what I have been working on a lot. But really, you have to consider the other forces as well. And of course, we have advisory. So there is issues of technology and governance. Well, one is technology for governance and governance for technology. And they are not the same thing, but they're both important. And so I think this is something which we're debating actively at the Kennedy School, where after years of trying, finally it is becoming more a central part. because every politician must realize the forces which are changing the world. And that's really important. And they produce the leaders. And I'm quite concerned about the United States in this regard, that we actually do that, so that our congressmen, all of them, really understand it. I go a lot to China. I've been going quite often in the last several years after I became Foreign Secretary. And Harvard and China have a lot of Tsinghua University has very strong ties with Tsinghua is their MIT or their IIT. And most of China's leaders come from Tsinghua University. And I think that's why I think they've been kind of strategic. They think in that mindset, and obviously the jury is still out how much this will succeed, but clearly the initial progress is kind of astounding. It's somehow state-sponsored capitalism by technologists who also understand some of these features. So anyway, so there are some deep questions here in the relationship between technology and society and how we train our students. So if you look back at the history of this field, the changing perception of technological progress in the United States, because that's where I teach my students. And of course, one of the iconic figures was Benjamin Franklin, of course, of Philadelphia fame. He was both an artist, a humanist, an engineer, invented lightning, and so on. And he had some very good views. Everything he did, I'm going to do it for society. And then he says technology progress ultimately should lead to social and political goals, including such things as freedom, law, and justice. So in fact, that is the deeper human issues which actually Benjamin Franklin articulated some 200 years ago. Then came Daniel Webster, another, Boston has a lot of these heroes as well. And Daniel Webster, in the late part of the last century, when railroads had come, the United States was being explored, oil was discovered, etc., he talked about technology progress only known as omniscience. People really were totally, it's like the internet era we now face. Oh, that's going to be just great. The Arab Spring, democracy is going to spread instantly. And then Henry Ford, technically, is going to general progress, which is an important driving force, actually, in many societies, including China, India, etc., because if you want to lift yourself from poverty. So I don't want to go into all of these, but there's a whole lot of work which has been done in it. And there has long been this divide since World War II. Actually, the role of public funds, technology was always often involved with the military for security. The Army Corps of Engineers were the first people to do engineering at United States, and even India. I think there's an intimate relationship. And in fact, the huge increases in funding in science and technology in the United States was really a product of the Second World War and the competition with the Soviet Union. So, but nevertheless, at that time, C.P. Snow gave a series of lectures on the two cultures, this divide between science and technology, arts and humanities. And of course, I think we are now at a stage, because of the computing revolution, because of the iPhone, because of whatever you like it, that we need to actually find this deeper symbiosis between the two. And I will not discuss in detail what C.P. Snow and critique that. It's now, but it's useful to remember that this dialogue has been going on for quite some time. So the social contract, one of the reasons, ever since Schumpeter and The Economist, I have a lot of economists and political scientists surrounding me, but previously I had mostly physicists and engineers surrounding me. And the central dogma of United States science and technology policy was more science equal to more innovation. Historically, societal progress is achieved through S&T advancements, just like ever since the, Industrial Revolution. Governments, therefore, have a duty to foster S&T innovation, including STEM education. S&T are self-regulating institutions and should be left free to set own agendas for innovation. Imperfection of the ideal contract can be fixed by three mechanisms: market, regulation, ethics. So we're going to have to come back and think about this, because in the internet generation, how will these work? The thing which I'm worrying most about today as a researcher in public policy is how to establish regulations or governance policies for emerging technologies. And these are very sensitive, because you don't want to thwart them too early, because then they won't progress. And however, they clearly will have to develop an adaptive system as we learn more, that the governance will have to evolve and not be rigid. There are lots of examples on the internet alone in that area. And in fact, Narayanamurti, when he first came to Harvard to give a lecture at the Kennedy School, he said, we succeeded because the license Raj hadn't quite taken over at that time in the internet. It grew so fast that they were able to get away and be as successful. So these are important points here about the ethics and the regulatory aspects and the governance aspects, which will be quite important as we think about it, and hopefully we can have a dialogue and discussion. So if you look at waves of innovation, there have been waves ever since the steam engine. By the way, I like to show this to all my students. The steam engine was invented by James Watt in 17-something in England, which started the Industrial Revolution. But people don't realize that it was not science. It was the invention which was the critical part. And the science of thermodynamics, which allowed you to make greater and better steam engines, happened 40, 50 years later because you wanted to make better steam engines. So how this symbiosis and cycle occurs is very important. Language is important. Sometimes science is a verb and science is a noun. Engineering is always a verb. Technology is noun. Engineering is a process, an act of creation, etc., and often misunderstood. I will be writing more on those kind of subjects because certainly Harvard and Oxford have suffered deeply on this, and even I believe in India. I came to the IIT, I'm digressing a little bit, as an assistant professor after my PhD at Cornell. And the thesis was not bad. I had a letter even from Linus Pauling, a Nobel laureate, that it was a nice piece of work. I gave lectures on it, and there were no equations. They thought I hadn't done anything because there weren't a whole lot of equations. That's an improper view. Physics is always theory and experiment, combining theory and I find that's a problem in political science. We'll come back to points of these. Education system has to change big time in linking theory with practice, with political science, with public policy, and not live in your own domain. And same goes for engineering. So that is the marching thing which I will do until the good Lord takes me. It's really important. I really think it's important. And so if you can look at this history from petrochemicals to the internet revolution, and today we don't know how this will evolve. We talk about sustainability, we talk about the green revolution, etc., and this is evolving. And obviously the internet itself is relatively new. It is only some 20, 30 years old significantly, and it's still in its early stage of maturity, and its broader impact on society. So there are important questions. How are we going to meet the great demands for energy? How can we provide the energy to fuel growing economies? Professor Shyam Saran, Ambassador Shah, and many others are worrying also on that aspect, especially on climate. And in fact, as we know, there are a whole lot of issues, including where energy policy, regulation, how the electricity system is designed, all of them need significant poverty. How can we lift billions of people out of extreme poverty and provide opportunity for all? Diseases, global health is a huge thing. And of course, where technology again becomes important. And so these are just a biosphere at rest. That's where really the issue is not just the climate, it also affects the oceans and all the other features. It's important. The digital divide, I still find we are going highly digital in India, but only 300 million people can actually use it. Still a large number, but there are 700 or 800 people missing. Even in the US, in fact, that's one of the big debates. In the old days, in 1934, when telephones became important, the US developed a law that you're going to provide universal service. That's how AT&T was created. And of course, you had to have a little charge because you provide to every village and every place, it costs a little more. You don't have the volume of scale, but it was accepted socially, and AT&T was a different kind of company than it is today. So there's just an example of governance issues, and India will face those with Aadhaar and all these other issues. Security. How can we reduce the threats to international security and particularly prevent nuclear proliferation terrorists? Actually, when I talk to my students, I quote many leaders, especially on internet and democracy. And in fact, Reagan will say, it is the oxygen of democracy. Hillary Clinton gave a tremendous speech on democracy and the internet after that. And then things happened like WikiLeaks, and suddenly it was not so good for the State Department. And I'm critical, I think she gave a very good speech, but so there were totally unintended consequences, and we know if you talk to the foreign secretary, you cannot have everything quite open. There is a diplomatic protocol how things are to be done. So there are great issues of, in fact, the relationship of technology and the fundamental values under which this country is founded and where United States were founded of democratic institutions. So we want to actually, hopefully we can have a serious debate on this, how we actually train our political leaders. So that's really what I want to primarily end my talk with, because I'd rather have an intense discussion with you on this subject. Technology as a site of politics. Langdon Winner wrote a paper once, a few years ago, Do Artifacts Have Politics? I.e., technology is some kind of thing. Does it have politics? Technological progress affects people differently. Because technology discriminates or makes grounds for discrimination, we always have to ask, progress for whom? Choices in technological design reallocate power and create winners and losers. They are therefore deeply political. And that's the lesson I've really learned. I'm very passionate about communications because of my Bell Labs past. It was so important that I could call my mother and my father after I got my PhD, that it would take 3 hours to make that phone call to India, but now I can call them in a matter of seconds with a clear voice because of the fiber optic channel. So it's really a very emotional and personal thing and for me, but we know what I've discovered. I've been working on internet policy and the governance of the internet is like my passion, and that it is deeply political because in fact the design of the internet was done by computer scientists and electrical engineers. They actually operated it and designed it as a trust. In research, this fundamental thing of research is openness. You actually communicate, that's how you learn, and there's trust that I'm telling the truth, you're telling the truth. And it's known as trustworthy computing. So in fact, when the packet of signal goes from one server to another, there's a verification process to make sure it is actually legitimate. So that's how it was designed. And at the early days, people thought that the internet will be used by the researchers. It was the National Science Foundation funded, we got transferred from the Department of Defense to the National Science Foundation to encourage research, in fact, and use that as a research tool. And of course, nobody foresaw how widely used it will be. And ultimately, when the telephone became a smartphone, it really changed the landscape big time. And in fact, so we really have to ask, how do we actually design this internet for the future? So there is a great deal of debate in the US, in the Federal Communications Commission. There are statutory independent bodies who are supposed to look at things objectively and apolitically and make a decision. There are lots of companies fighting about how the internet is to be used. And I don't know how many of you have heard the word, I'm sure it's true for many people in India, the word net neutrality. When the telecommunications system was designed in the US, it followed the telecommunications law. AT&T was required to send anybody's signal, and they were not asked what political view is, etc. It's supposed to be neutral, just a medium of transmission. And that is what is in debate, whether it should be part of the internet. Or there are issues, in fact, whether you pay different amounts depending on the speed of the internet. You know, if the speed isn't very good, your web and all your other things don't work very well. And do you want to pay more as a function? You can justify it. And then there are the internet service providers, the companies which actually provide it, maybe Reliance, Airtel here, in the US it's AT&T, Verizon, etc., Comcast. And then there are the content providers like Netflix and others. They have a different view. And so there is this inherent conflict. The Democratic Congress and many of my colleagues, I personally still want to debate this. I'm not sure we want to be totally dogmatic about net neutrality. It's an important issue which I think needs to be thought through because the internet generation is different from telecommunications. Those laws were done in 1934, modified in 1996, but indeed nobody thought that actually how computing and communications would merge. So this has to be debated, and there are winners and losers. So it is both a political and an economic decision. So, in fact, the Federal Communications Commission was going to rule on this, very contentious. And it was in 2014 when President Obama was the president, and the chair of the federal is usually 5 members. There are usually 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans in the US, and the chair usually came from the ruling governing party. So they had the vote, if you like. So, and the president, just like the Federal Reserve Board, is not supposed to interfere. They're supposed to make this decision objectively. I want to show you why, example, internet as a federal polity. So this thing doesn't come very well, but I've lost my. I've lost the cursor, that's my point. Maybe. Anyway, so Obama gave a public speech which looked like instructing Chairman Wheeler.
Hi, everybody. Ever since the internet was created, it's been organized around basic principles of openness, fairness, and freedom. There are no gatekeepers deciding which sites you get to access. There are no toll roads on the information superhighway. This set of principles, the idea of net neutrality, has unleashed the power of the internet and given innovators the chance to thrive. Abandoning these principles would threaten to end the internet as we know it. That's why I'm laying out a plan to keep the internet free and open. And that's why I'm urging the Federal Communications Commission to do everything they can to protect net neutrality for everyone. They should make it clear that whether you use a computer, phone, or tablet, internet providers have a legal obligation not to block or limit your access to a website. Cable companies can't decide which online stores you can shop at or which streaming services you can use. And they can't let any company pay for priority over its competitors. To put these protections in place, I'm asking the FCC to reclassify internet service under Title II of a law known as the Telecommunications Act. In plain English, I'm asking them to recognize that for most Americans, the internet has become an essential part of everyday communication and everyday life. The FCC is an independent agency, and ultimately this decision is theirs alone. But the public has already commented nearly 4 million times, asking the FCC to make sure that consumers, not the cable company, gets to decide which sites they use. Americans are making their voices heard and standing up for the principles that make the internet a powerful force for change. As long as I'm president, that's what I'll be fighting for too.
So that was roughly 2 or 3 years ago. And, most academics, including many of my Harvard colleagues, including in some ways, including several of my postdocs, they all really emotionally talk about net neutrality. And of course we want, because in fact, one of the arguments also is companies like Netflix and others would not, and YouTube would not have been able to come alive if in fact there had been a huge price differential, etc. So it's a complicated question, and now they all have some slightly different views now that they've made it, and we'll stop the little guy again. So there are some real social issues anyway, but Obama was severely criticized. He was careful, he says meant to be independent, but the fact that the president makes a public statement was not looked upon kindly by certain Republicans on the other side. And then, in fact, if you want to, and it was of course the White House enough, I seem to have lost now. I don't know why it went back. I'm going the wrong way here. Sorry, it is. In 2016, November, as you know, President Trump got elected, and there was a new federal communications chair. Now there are 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And as somebody of Indian origin, this man figures prominently in many of the local India papers in the United States. He's replaced Wheeler. He is the chair of the federal, and is Ajit Pai, one of Indian origin. And he really made the following statement. I think I'm going to need your help again. I can't find the cursor.
But 2 years ago, the federal government's approach suddenly changed. The FCC, on a party line vote, decided to impose a set of heavy-handed regulations upon the internet. It decided to slap an old regulatory framework called Title II, originally designed in the 1930s for the Ma Bell telephone monopoly, upon thousands of internet service providers, big and small. It decided to put the federal government at the center of the internet. Why? Unfortunately, the answer has nothing to do with the law or the facts. Nothing about the internet was broken in 2015. Nothing about the law had changed. And there was not a rash of internet service providers blocking consumers from accessing the content, applications, or services of their choice. No, it was all about politics. Days after a disappointing 2014 midterm election, and in order to energize a dispirited base, the White House released an extraordinary and unprecedented YouTube video instructing the FCC to implement Title II regulations. This was a transparent attempt to compromise the independence of the agency. And it worked. Notwithstanding the revisionist history offered by some, the FCC was not moving towards Title II regulation before the White House announcement. It was dragged kicking and screaming down that path.
So I think you get the idea how, and this is really true even on democracy, etc. As we know today, if you open your newspaper, and I can tell you in the United States, a very serious issue, because I think the two countries which pride themselves, one thing great about India with the way the election commission that generally viewed that our elections are fair. You can always argue whether you, and so on, and same with the United States. And if it's not fair, it really is a huge issue. But how Facebook has been compromised is a very, very serious issue. I actually had a meeting at the Kennedy School about 2 weeks ago exactly on this subject, because already this was being talked about. It's now come much more in the open, especially with Cambridge Analytica. And we had Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google and also member of the President's Science and Technology Advisory Committee, and he sits on the board of Facebook, and he said, and Google will be affected too, and others, that the technology companies will have to pay attention to this very, very seriously and fix the problem. Otherwise, the regulators will do it. And so I think actually it's in their self-interest that and actually they have the smarts that at least, I think you should know that it's a very complex thing, because generally in security, it's the nation state which is important, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Pakistan, you name it, Iran, etc. But in the internet world, there are a lot of non-state actors. And of course, the Russians will say, we didn't do it, it was some Russian guys, I can't do that, and that may be true, I don't know, and so on. And that's going to be true often when the Iran nuclear establishment was affected, etc., or North Korea attacked the Sony pictures and did that, because in fact, there are a whole lot of non-state actors as well, and the whole issue which people who are foreign service experts can tell you about whether nation states are still kind of the right way of thinking about it. So there's a whole bunch of issues here which I think need to be debated significantly at the global level as well. So I think it's obvious this debate has not ended. We don't know yet the consequences of the new ruling, whether the companies the internet service providers like Verizon and Comcast, the equivalent ones in India, I don't know what the rules are yet, but in the US, whether they will then start charging me a lot more than they may charge Netflix because there's a big customer, etc. And I think the people will be watching. In the short term, I think there'll be no effect because people will be very careful. But in the longer term, there are some consequences, and that one must do it in some kind of progressive way, because I can see arguments really on both sides. There are winners and losers. It's a social thing. I still remember as a Cornell grad student, I used to often go to Ithaca afterwards, and flights to Ithaca were quite cheap, and then they deregulated the airline industry. It was much cheaper to fly almost to India than to fly to Cornell. So this is a social choice. It always is a social choice, and we are facing this, and then it becomes a political choice. So that's one example. It goes all over. Now again, I'm doing it the wrong way. I really can't find this cursor. It's too.
We don't want to hear him.
It is a very short clip where he convenes the White House press and says the United States is pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which President Obama negotiated very carefully with the Chinese, the French, and the Indians, and I'm going to go my own way because it's unfair to the United States. It was more of a political statement, and then So you can see within the span of 1 year or 2 years, major things like internet policy in the United States, like what you call climate change, have become huge political football, where technology is intimately related to the politics and to society. Finally, we've all been talking about fake news, and if you look at this next clip.
In an age where there's so much active misinformation, and it's packaged very well, and it looks the same when you see it on a Facebook page or you turn on your television. If we are not serious about facts and what's true and what's not, if we can't discriminate between serious arguments and propaganda, then we have problems. If everything seems to be the same and no distinctions are made, then...
So I think it's very clear that this is a huge issue. As a person steeped in science and engineering, I never knew the word alternative facts. Either they are facts, I'm not an expert of the English language, or they're not facts. So there's no such thing as alternative facts. This is a very extremely deep human issue, goes beyond Benjamin Franklin, John Quincy Adams, and all the good forefathers of the United States, or Mohandas Gandhi. You can pick our ones from India. And this is becoming a serious effect, which is actually permeating the political landscape big time. So I think, and where the technology companies, the internet companies, and the social world at large is becoming intertwined in more ways than one. Teaching at the Kennedy School, where I created this program on cybersecurity and internet policy, it's now really because I had a hard time. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was still in the beginning stages, and nobody thought it was going to be that important. Everything would be nuclear, and nuclear would be the important threat, not the cyber. It's now very different, of course, today. The nuclear is still important. But I think what I was saddened in the teaching, when I had this postdoctoral fellow, a Harvard PhD in political science and government, and a computer science PhD from Oxford, and a law graduate from Columbia, worked together, and two of them are doing really well. And Lucas, the political scientist, wrote the first paper on cyber security and cyber weapons. He's now written a book which is now going to be very important. I urge people to read it because I think it's important. And his first paper, long paper, to submit it to the International Journal of Security, they were rejecting it, but he gave it to me to read. I was a supervisor, and I was really encouraging him. I had a really hard time understanding the paper. I said, Lucas, what are you doing? My English is not so bad. I went to St. Stephen's College. I think I know English. And he said, Dean Venki, if I didn't write it this way, I'll never get my tenure in the political science department. Language has to change on both sides. I like to say engineers have to know not only how things work, but how the world works. And that's really important. So in fact, we really now, at a national level, actually for engineering, really want to create grand challenge scholars who are thinking about the grand challenges facing society, encouraging the young people to cross this divide and really learn the larger issues of society. And the same holds for the humanists and the social scientists. How are you going to regulate the internet if you don't even understand a simple thing, how the packet goes? Or in energy, they don't understand the difference in energy and power. You don't have to become a physicist to do that. That is really important, and not just assume it's a big black box which somehow the technologists will be the technicians. This has to change significantly. And academia has to change significantly in actually bridging this divide between theory and practice. That doesn't mean we don't like theorists. We do need some, but it really has to be the broader way how we evaluate our colleagues, how we structure. There'll be room for specialized institutions, but there will be room for these other kind of institutions, what I would define as a broadly educated person in the 21st century. Liberal arts education is still a good idea, but it cannot remain in the dark ages. It must evolve with the problems facing society. Thank you very much. I really appreciate so many of you coming here on a Friday evening, and it's wonderful to see, and I hope we can have a lively discussion for a little while.
So I'm sure all of you will agree that this has been a most stimulating presentation by someone who has really thought very deeply about these issues. As he said, the sort of divide that we have between science on one side and humanities on the other, that has become almost irrelevant now. And the sooner we try to bridge that divide, the better it would be in terms of the challenges that we are facing. Just to take an example from my own profession of diplomacy, we have always thought about diplomacy as something which is related to very cool deliberation, that you think about, the issue in front of you, and you never come out with, off-the-cuff reactions. And today we have Twitter diplomacy. So, most of diplomats are always trying to catch up with what is coming out on the Twitter and in the Facebook. It's a new world altogether. And many of us do not know how to navigate this world. You mentioned, of course, these very important aspects that we have to deal with. I just wanted to get you, if I may, as the first questioner, get you to just say a few words about the big controversy that we are currently facing in India, when we have seen what has happened with this Cambridge Analytica, the impact of Facebook and the data that is being utilized for political purposes, fears in India that something similar could happen here, and has it happened already before in India with respect to some of the elections which have taken place. So there is a growing concern about these issues. Do we have a lot of conveniences from technology, and we are in a sense not paying for it. But at the same time, we are paying for it because the data which is being generated by us as individuals and as societies have become actually valuable assets.
I'm glad you brought that. I have not brought that point up. That's an extremely important point. Very important.
So you are actually buying those conveniences by, in a sense, relinquishing your control over the data that you are generating constantly through your smartphone, through your Facebook. I must tell you that despite a huge amount of pressure, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook, and today I think maybe I'm perhaps a wise old man, having not...
Well, even though I'm a technophile, I'm not on Facebook for the same reason, because in fact...
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to, because of what you have mentioned, that, this is deeply political,
So I think really important point, which Ambassador Saran brought up, which I should have brought up earlier, is these companies have got some of our real intellectual assets. They have all kinds of information on us. You cannot sign in unless you do that. Everybody wants your email address, and then you get all the advertisements. So many of these companies started very idealistically. This includes, especially Google, I knew, Gmail, everything. But ultimately, when they get monetized, then there's a conflict of interest. That's the problem with the internet. So Google, if you like, will go for the search engines, just like this person was trying to Google me. They'll always direct you to something else, including fixing my hotel, because that's where the money is, because they've got that information. So I think this is why there will have to be combination. First of all, you will have to hold companies to a high ethical standard. If they're getting the data really that you cannot share. I know as a professor, if I was careless with the grades, etc., with my students, I'd be fired from Harvard, because there are certain aspects which are private between me and the student or me and the faculty, etc. And somehow they will have to be subject to a serious fine or whatever, so they know. But more importantly, we'll have to have a code of ethics for these CEOs. This is important. in medical area. And of course, there are always people who do that, but there is a code. There are companies which actually have very high standards, including the US and all over the world. And that will happen. And then regulations will have to be put in place in this matter, because once you start monetizing it, then it's an issue. And the data is being monetized. And we all sign up because we get frustrated. We have a 5-page small print which you can't read, and we are technically agreeing to it, and you don't know what you're agreeing to. That's a separate issue with law, how you actually put them in plain English language or plain Hindi, where everybody can understand. That somehow does not seem to be the case. So I think these are because there's data, huge issues of privacy as well. Not just the fake news and this democratic issue, which is a very fundamental value, but there are all these other issues of privacy, which is partly what you are also referring to, which are human. So this intersection will have to be debated. And the industry will have to self-fix it, otherwise they will be in significant trouble. I mean, I think many companies have failed when they did not ultimately work properly for society. The stock market can be quite brutal. And it can be quite brutal, which is sort of good. It will be correction here. The companies which actually own up quickly, most famous case was Johnson & Johnson. When somebody's laced their pills with cyanide, they immediately took it off the shelf and took responsibility. So I think the fact that Facebook delayed it bothers me. They should have taken that responsibility very quickly, and then people know that they are serious about correcting it and really know they have a problem. We cannot respect them for their privacy. The same is true for the government. The government may not also be such a good protector of your privacy and the data. That could be a problem with and these other things which we're debating in this country.